The Mojave Desert is a place where beauty hides deadly danger. Boundless sandy plains deceive with their tranquility, while rocky hills and narrow canyons conceal traps that can take even the most experienced travelers by surprise. Here, the sun turns the horizons into deceptive mirages, scorching the ground beneath your feet. And at nightfall, the silence is filled with the rustling of poisonous snakes and scorpions. Every step here can be fatal, and the slightest mistake, the beginning of the fight for life. It is in this harsh and merciless realm that one of the most amazing and inspiring stories of the struggle for survival took place. Southern California, Joshua Tree National Park, September 2010. The sun was scorching mercilessly over the Mojave Desert. The heat rose in shuddering waves, making the sand and rocks shimmer like red-hot metal. Everything around them was drowned in silence, broken occasionally by the wind. The landscape seemed a living reminder of how easily nature could overpower man. Here, any mistake could be the last. Joshua trees stood alone on the horizon, strange, knotty trunks with thorny branches, as if they were made for movies about other worlds. Their gaunt silhouettes looked deceptively welcoming. They offered neither shelter nor water, only adding to the loneliness of this harsh place. On this sweltering morning, 64-year-old Ed Rosenthal, a hiker and poet from Los Angeles, was preparing for a familiar hike. For him, Joshua Tree has long been a second home. For nearly 2 decades, Ed has returned here to hike his favorite trails and find inspiration in the rugged beauty of the desert. Just another hike today, he thought as he stuffed a bright orange backpack into the trunk. A compass, first aid kit, a couple of candy bars, and a container of water were all ready for the 3-hour hike up Warren Peak. Ed knew the route like the back of his hand. The trail led to the summit, which offered spectacular views of the San Bernardino Mountains. He pulled out of the hotel in Desert Hot Springs a little later than he'd planned. The dashboard was flashing 94 degrees Fahrenheit, about 34 degrees Celsius. The morning had just begun, but the heat was already building. His wife had warned him about the weather, but Ed only smiled back. "I've hiked this trail dozens of times. It'll be fine." When he reached the parking lot, it was unaccustomedly crowded. It annoyed him a little. Ed valued the privacy of his walks, but he quickly found a spot for his car, threw on his backpack, and putting on his hat, strode confidently down the trail. Just another day in the desert, he thought as he breathed in the dry, hot air. Ed felt confident. Despite his 64 years, he was in great shape. Long years of hiking had hardened him, taught him to overcome difficulties and listen to his body. The familiar landscape seemed almost homelike. Withered shrub leaves crunched under his feet, and rocky hills rose in the distance. With each step, he felt more and more strongly how everyday cares remained somewhere behind, dissolving into the merciless silence of the desert. For him, hiking was more than sport or recreation. It was a ritual. After years of work, amidst constant pressure and stress, Joshua Tree became something of a refuge for Ed. Here he found the inspiration and peace he sorely lacked in the city. Today his goal was Warren Peak. It was a place that had always left him in awe. At the summit, with its breathtaking view of San Jacinto Mountain, Ed felt all petty worries fade away before the majesty of nature. But this time, it was not business as usual. He was in a hurry, trying to make up for lost time. The climb was unexpectedly hard as the sun rose higher, making every step a real struggle. The water in his backpack was running out too fast, and the unbearable heat made him more thirsty. When Ed reached the summit, he felt tired for the first time in a long time. His body seemed to resist every movement. He sat down on a hot rock, enjoying the panorama, and took a last sip of water. For a moment he tried to relax, but his thoughts began to jumble. Only a few hours, he reassured himself, looking at the trail leading back. But this very moment would be the beginning of one of the most difficult challenges of his life. The return trip began with an incomprehensible uneasiness that Ed had no way of explaining. As he descended Warren Peak, He stopped to find the beginning of the trail. Normally, this section was painfully familiar to him, but now, no matter how much he looked, it was as if the trail had dissolved. The ground around it was covered with thick bushes and dry grass, and the bright glare of the sun reflecting off the sand was confusing. "Am I really that tired?" he thought, covering his eyes with his hand, trying to focus. Unable to find a clear landmark, Ed decided to walk in the direction he thought would lead him to the car. But after a few minutes of walking through the loose, sandy soil, the trail disappeared completely. The vast desert stretched out before him, identical in every direction. Ed tried to remain calm. This landscape was familiar to him. He had been here many times. "Everything's under control," he urged himself, though each step plunged him deeper into uncertainty. "Where am I?" he thought. The sun was moving inexorably toward sunset. In the morning it had been an enemy, searing and merciless, but now its passing colored the horizon in bright orange and scarlet tones, giving the landscape an ominous beauty. The long shadows of the Joshua trees stretched across the ground, but even in their shelter it remained sweltering. Ed stopped and looked around carefully. Everything around him looked the same: rocky hills, overgrown bushes, parched stream beds. He tried to gauge his position by the sun, but realized he'd gone too far off the familiar path. "All right, move down. Rivers lead to people." He remembered a survival rule from one of the books he had read. Gathering himself, he picked a direction and moved down the slope. But the farther he went, the clearer the feeling became that he was only getting deeper into this desert trap, and with each passing minute the confidence was leaving him. As darkness fell, Ed's anxiety increased. His heart thudded in his chest, drowning out his own breathing. He stopped, suddenly realizing it was too risky to go any further. The desert was relentless at night. One false step, and he could twist his leg or fall into an invisible crevasse. Ed took off his backpack and pulled out a thermal blanket. Crouching between two large rocks, he wrapped himself in the fabric, trying to shield himself from the increasing wind. The sky above him was studded with stars, their cold brilliance emphasizing the absolute silence around him. This silence of the desert, which had once given Ed peace, now depressed him. "Tomorrow morning I'll continue the journey," he urged himself, trying to concentrate on practical things. There was still a small supply of food in his backpack, but what he was most concerned about was water. He knew finding it was a top priority, but just as he started to make plans, other darker thoughts popped into his head. "What if I die here?" flashed through his mind. He remembered his wife, Nicole. What would she say when she found out he was missing? Who would even find him in this vast, merciless space? Ed shook his head, trying to rid himself of these thoughts. He closed his eyes, hoping to find some peace, but anxiety, like an intrusive whisper, kept him awake. At dawn, Ed awoke with a feeling of heaviness throughout his body. His movements were slow, as if he were trying to get through a thick, invisible fog. Every effort was difficult. His body, dehydrated and exhausted, no longer obeyed. It felt alien. Wandering through the desert, he found the bed of a dried-up river. "Rivers lead to people," he reminded himself of the rule, clinging to the thought that this might be his salvation. Deciding to follow the bed, Ed walked more and more slowly, feeling more and more empty inside with each passing hour. By late afternoon, he reached a narrow canyon that could serve as shelter, but instead of relief, a sense of despair and terror overwhelmed him. He realized the chances of rescue were slim. Trying to retain a modicum of sanity, Ed scratched out an arrow in the sand, indicating the direction he was heading. "In case they follow my footsteps," he thought, though he knew inside himself that if anyone started looking, it wouldn't be until tomorrow at the earliest. The second evening came quickly, as if time was deliberately hurried. Exhausted, Ed found shelter between the rocks. The sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving him in total darkness, and the desert was once again a cold trap. The warm daytime air was replaced by the piercing chill of night. Ed wrapped himself in a thermal blanket, but his body was still shivering, and his parched mouth and throat were a reminder of how desperately he needed water. He tried to calm himself, fighting the panic that was coming up. The next morning, the truth hit him with renewed force. There was no more water left. The energy for the long trek was gone too. Each step was difficult. His breathing grew heavier and heavier, and the desert landscape around him seemed more and more hostile. Now Ed realized that he wasn't just lost. He was trapped in the vast desert. The third day began with an oppressive sense of powerlessness. Ed waded along the dried-up riverbed, clinging to the faint hope of finding a drop of water. His throat was dry and his tongue felt like coarse sandpaper. His thoughts were confused, making every decision an agonizing process. At one point he stopped and stared at the horizon. It seemed to him that in the distance something glistened like water. Gathering the rest of his strength, he got up and headed for the mirage. But after only a few minutes it became clear. It was just a play of light on the hot earth. "Shit! I'm going crazy!" he wheezed, his voice barely audible. Anger at himself and his own powerlessness was replaced by a wave of despair. Ed knew that the dehydration was already beginning to affect his mind. He forced himself to focus on the simplest of actions. Step forward, wipe away the sweat, find some shade. But each hour stretched into infinity, as if the desert itself was taunting him. His hands and feet were covered with scratches from the thorns of the bushes. His face burned under the merciless sun, and his chest burned with each heavy breath. Remembering the words of his hiking buddy, Ed grasped for one last hope. Yucca might provide some moisture. He pulled out a Swiss knife and set about cutting through the plant's hard trunk. Even with effort, however, the knife barely left a mark on its surface. After a few minutes of struggle, he still pulled a few fibers out of the trunk. Putting them in his mouth, he realized it was useless. The fibers were dry and stiff, and trying to squeeze moisture out of them only increased his frustration. This is pointless, Ed thought, tossing the remains of the plant aside. His strength was running low, and even the faintest shade brought no relief. By nightfall on the third day, Ed felt despair slowly but surely gripping him. He sank to the dry ground, setting aside his backpack, and looked up to the starry sky. The deep silence of the desert enveloped him, broken only by the pounding of his heart. There, high above, among the countless stars, he spotted the lights of passenger airplanes. "They're flying home," flashed through his mind. "And it looks like I'm going to die here." The thought cut him like a cold blade. Breathing hard, he fumbled in his shirt pocket for a pen. Finding his hat, Ed began writing on the inside of it. A message for his wife, instructions for his friends, scraps of thoughts that could be his last words. Line by line, he spat out what he wanted to pass on if he was found. On the fourth day, exhausted and weary, Ed noticed a crevice in the sandstone. It looked like a hiding place, and he decided to go down there. At first, the descent seemed easy, but as he took another step down, his foot suddenly slipped. Ed tried to keep his balance, but his foot caught in a narrow gap between the rocks. Pain shot through him and his heart raced. Gritting his teeth, he pulled his leg out and sat down against the canyon wall. His pulse gradually slowed, but one thought remained in his mind. One more wrong step could end it all. He looked around, trying to figure out where he was. Suddenly, he realized the scary thing. His gaze fell on a bone, an old, dried bone that was familiar to him. It was exactly like the one he had seen a few days ago. Turning his head, he noticed his own footprints, barely recognizable in the sand. "I'm walking in circles," he whispered. The thought disappointed him. Everything he had thought was progress was proving to be an illusion. All the effort, all the struggle was a waste of energy. He was going in circles, and the desert seemed to mock him. Ed's strength was finally leaving him. On the fourth night, he gathered up the rest of his belongings, spread them around him, and lay down on the sand, wrapped in a thermal blanket. "If anyone finds me, let them know I at least tried," he thought, looking up at the stars. His mind tossed between dream and delirium. He saw the faces of his family, heard their voices. The shadows of the canyon grew deeper, and the world around him slowly dissolved into darkness. On the 5th day, Ed awoke with the feeling that his body no longer belonged to him. His lips were chapped and crusty, his throat burning as if he'd swallowed hot sand. His arms and legs could barely move, as if they had lost their last strength. The sun's rays shining through the cracks in the sandstone were a reminder of the mercilessness of the desert. Ed lay there unable to move, until a slight breeze brought a faint odor. It was a damp scent that couldn't have been here. Perhaps it was a play of his exhausted imagination, but there was no choice. Gritting his teeth, he gathered the last of his strength and pulled himself up. Crawling, leaning on the rough canyon walls, he began to move toward the faint wind. Every meter seemed an agonizing ordeal. He stumbled, fell, hit the rocks painfully several times, but each time he forced himself up. Suddenly his hand came across something wet. A tiny puddle of water appeared in the shadow of the sandy ledge where the piece of bark had lingered. It was almost impossible to see, but to Ed, it was a miracle. He fumbled for a piece of cloth in his backpack, soaked it in the water, and squeezed it greedily onto his tongue. The drops, so meager and bitter, seemed like a treasure to him. This tiny find gave him back a glimmer of hope. On the 6th day, Ed barely realized where he was. Time had lost its meaning, merging into one agonizing and endless moment. His body felt like nothing more than an empty shell that refused to obey. He packed the rest of his belongings into his backpack, but he couldn't move on. His mind said, "Stay. If you keep going, you'll die." Ed leaned against the sand wall, looking hopelessly at his gear. A thermal blanket with a shiny metallic coating that had accidentally fallen out of his backpack gleamed in the sun. This little thing, which had seemed insignificant to him before, suddenly gave him an idea. If I can't find them, they can find me, he thought, feeling a faint spark of determination. Gathering the last of his strength, he stretched the thermal blanket out on the rocks so that it reflected the sun's rays. Then, completely exhausted, Ed collapsed to the ground, his breathing becoming shallow, but he forced himself to remain still. Ed awoke to a sound that seemed almost unreal to him. It was a hum, distant and muffled, but not like the whispering of the wind or the cracking of desert rocks. His mind refused to believe it at first, but the sound grew closer, becoming the distinct roar of an engine. He squinted, lifting his head, and through the blinding sun he could make out the silhouette of a helicopter that was slowly descending into the crevice of the canyon. As the pilot and rescuer ran up to him, Ed tried to smile, but his body was too exhausted. He was only able to weakly raise his arm, showing that he was still alive. His voice was hoarse, barely audible, but those words carried all the strength of his spirit. "I'm still here." The lifeguard handed him a bottle of water, and Ed drank it greedily, ignoring the careful warnings to drink slowly. Every drop felt like a return to life to him. They carefully pulled him out of the canyon, loaded him into a helicopter, and flew him to the nearest hospital. At the hospital, Ed spent several days in intensive care. His body was recovering from severe dehydration, sunburn, and general exhaustion. Doctors said 1 or 2 more days in the desert could have been fatal for him. Back home, Ed often thought back to those days in Joshua Tree. Every step, every sip of water, every decision, it all now seemed to him a chain of events that, despite its randomness, had led him to salvation. But one thing warmed his heart most of all. He was able to see his family. When he crossed the threshold of the house, his wife and daughter hugged him as tightly as they had ever hugged him before. In that moment, Ed realized what he had fought for what he had risen each time when it seemed he couldn't go on. The ordeal in the desert had changed Ed forever. He became more cautious and careful, no longer relying solely on his experience. Now he never hiked without a satellite beacon and an extra supply of water. He learned to respect nature's unpredictability and embrace its power. He never stopped traveling. Joshua Tree, and other places still beckoned him with their beauty and solitude. These experiences did not take away his passion for the outdoors, but instead made him more aware of the importance of being prepared for anything and treating the world around him with awe. Ed often shared his story with friends, recounting those days in the wilderness. And each time he would repeat one thought that became central to him. Even when it seems like it's all over, there's always something left in a person that keeps them going. That's what saves. This story is another reminder of how powerful and unpredictable nature can be. What do you think helped Ed survive in these conditions? Could you have handled such an ordeal on your own? What precautions would you take when traveling to the desert? Write in the comments. Your experience and opinion may be valuable to others. If you like this video, don't forget to give us a like. It helps us to develop our channel and create new interesting materials. Subscribe to not miss the latest stories, and be sure to share this video with your friends. That's all for now. Take care, and remember, respect for nature and careful preparation are the key to safety. See you in the next episodes.